Omegle, the infamous random video website with more dicks than a fraternity initiation ritual, shut down earlier this month. If you need your fix of getting jump scared by genitalia or racial slurs on a video call, I think chat roulette is still available. But in all seriousness, seeing Omegle shut down sent me on a brain blast to my formative years on the internet. Memories started unlocking, and I remembered a name that I hadn't thought of in years. Remember ooVoo? The first thing that comes to many people's minds when they hear ooVoo is the "I never went to ooVoo Java" vine.
Who's the hottest Uber driver you've ever had?
I never went to ooVoo Java.
But for those who actually don't know, ooVoo was like the digital lunchroom video chat, where you would just get on with your friends, like 6 to 12 of them at a time, and just like hang out. Many teens from like 2009 to like 2015 will have very fond memories of being on ooVoo with their friends. Or at least that's what I thought. A few people on the internet have asked, do you guys remember ooVoo? And I would say like 50% of the responses are like, what the hell is that? And the other 50% are like, oh my God, I totally forgot. So it's led me down a rabbit hole trying to answer the question of what happened to ooVoo? Who used it? Why is it loved by some people but completely forgotten by others? And all of this led me further down a different rabbit hole into the history of video chatting, which is fascinating and also goes back a lot further than I thought. So let's get into it. Omegle shutting down is really notable because it's one of the first video services that actually got widespread use by the average person. Video chatting to many people who are alive today used to feel like this distant, futuristic thing. Look at this scene in Back to the Future Part 2, which came out in 1989. This is supposed to be the year 2015, and they're calling each other on video screens. They almost nailed what it's really like to be in 2015. But they should have gotten rid of the fax machines. The idea that video chatting was eventually going to be a big part of our future was not some shot in the dark prediction by the movie people. In fact, when they were making that movie, the technology had already existed for years. The first public display of video chatting technology was in 1927, or almost 100 years ago from today. It was a one-way video call between the president of AT&T and the soon-to-be president of the United States, Herbert Hoover. The New York Times was in awe, reporting that it was like a photograph came to life. The Boston Globe called it a phenomenal feat, but one with no definite purpose. I think it's pretty crazy to like see video chatting for the first time and think, wow, that has no use. But I definitely know some people feel that way when they get that random FaceTime call from like an acquaintance and they're like, yo, this could have been a text message. Perhaps part of the reason why they felt that way is because the technological limitations of the time made video chatting inaccessible to the vast majority of people. Back then, it was obviously a lot less convenient than just picking up your phone and opening an app. In fact, you didn't have a cell phone. Nobody had a cell phone. So when the first publicly available video chatting service released in Germany in 1936, the only way to access it was to make an appointment through the post office and then go to one of the booths that they had in the city. And then whoever you're trying to video chat would have to go to their booth closest to them at a specific time. So there was no spontaneity in it. You had to like schedule it like way in advance to do it. And a 3-minute call using that service cost about 1/15 of the average weekly wage in Germany at the time. So this was really expensive. But I still think it's pretty crazy that Germany had that technology available to the public in the 1930s. But I guess when we think of Germany in the 1930s, there was some other stuff going on. So yeah, because of World War II, plans to expand that service never actually took shape, and by 1940, the whole thing was shut down. Back in the US, after that first demonstration of the technology, the AT&T company stayed hard at work on developing it and figuring out the next way to bring it to the public. They knew that the technology at the time was lacking, but they saw potential in the idea for whenever the tech was ready to catch up. And in 1964, at the World's Fair in New York, they finally saw the opportunity to reveal the picturephone. They had the First Lady of the United States, Lady Bird Johnson, demonstrate the technology. And at the demonstration, it was this like tube-like thing. But by the time it released 6 years later in 1970, it was more of this like cube box thing. The AT&T picturephone that was released in 1970 is widely considered to be one of the biggest commercial flops of all time. Why? I mean, it looks pretty cool, right? First of all, it costs about $1,000 in today's money after inflation. And also, being an early adapter of this kind of technology meant that you couldn't call anybody else unless they also bought one. And this is the first time that we see that some people really just don't want to be on camera. They would prefer a phone call. As like Gen Z and millennials, like we don't think about this because we're so used to being on camera a lot. Like people are always recording and taking pictures and whatever. Like in the 70s, like people were not used to that at all. Like, so it's very strange. Like people were not done up and like ready to be on FaceTime, you know? Like there was no culture around that. And even today we can relate to this when we get on a Zoom call or a class that's on Zoom or whatever, right? And we want to keep our cameras off, right? We don't always want to be on camera. And at the time, the interest in being on camera was not particularly that high. So even though the technology was cool, the demand wasn't necessarily there. And even for people who did want to be on camera, It was so blurry, the picture, that like it wasn't really worth it for them either. AT&T tried one more time in 1992 with the video phone 2500. It looked kind of like the landline phones that you would see in a hotel room today, but with a little screen on it. It retailed for a whopping $1,499, which is already expensive, but with inflation to today is like $3,000 plus. The craziest part is that to successfully call your distant relative or whoever you're trying to talk to on it, they needed one too. So they were often sold in pairs. So now you gotta double all that money to think about how much you really had to spend. And if you didn't want to buy one, you could rent one for $30 a day. Unsurprisingly, this whole thing was shut down by 1995, and it was another flop. AT&T was actually the only company working on this kind of technology for a while because they had a monopoly on telephone services in the United States for a huge chunk of the 1900s. But by the time the 80s rolled around, that was starting to change, and there were other companies entering the fray. And at the same time, some international competitors were also trying to jump in the ring as well. So even though all these attempts that AT&T was throwing at the wall were completely failing, people were still pushing forward because everybody pretty much saw the potential for this kind of technology. The biggest roadblock that everybody was running into in this process was the analog telephone lines just couldn't handle the size of the images fast enough to make them look good. But as telephone lines became digitized, the ability to compress the images became a reality. A man named Harry Santamaki created his own version of the video phone that was released in 1984. Well, this one wasn't a complete flop. It was mostly bought by telephone companies so that they can demonstrate the technology rather than by like the average household or the average person. So it never took over the mainstream as like a thing that people would buy and have in their houses. But it was not a flop. We were getting closer to seeing this technology succeed in real time. But the truth is, telephone technology was not ready for this kind of stuff on a massive scale. So it wasn't until the internet boom that video calling became a reality. The way that the webcam video was invented might surprise you though. A bunch of scientists in the University of Cambridge in England had a problem. They had one coffee pot and a lot of coffee drinkers. And the coffee pot was located in the main office, which was actually kind of far for a lot of the scientists. So some of them would end up walking, 5, 10, 15 minutes to get there and just to find out that there was no coffee in the pot. So one of them decided maybe if I set up a camera and it took a picture every 20 seconds of the coffee pot, then we could see before we left our desks if there was going to be coffee in there or not. And these guys were science nerds, so they were able to code that camera to run those pictures onto everyone's computer on the local network. So as long as you were a scientist working there and your computer was hooked up to the network, every 20 seconds, you could access a picture of the coffee pot to see how much coffee was in it. One of the scientists, Dr. Martin Johnson, for whatever reason, his computer was not hooked up to the local network, but he personally had been researching this new thing called the internet. And he thought, hey, I think I can code something on the internet that would just run these pictures right to my computer. And it only took 10 lines of code. And when he did that, he invented the first webcam. And word quickly spread about this coffee pot, and it became an early internet sensation. Millions of people would tune in to watch that coffee pot go up and down. It ran for years, and the pot itself was sold at an auction for over 3,000 British pounds. The internet was a much better host for video chatting than the old telephone infrastructure was. Webcams were way cheaper to the public than all of those video phone devices that we talked about. One of the first webcams, called the Quick Cam, retailed for about $100. And in addition, you didn't have to pay whatever fees the telephone company was charging to send that data back and forth. Webcams slowly crept into the mainstream psyche in the 90s, and by the turn of the century, computer manufacturers started building them into laptops and monitors for your desktop computer, so more and more people started to have these webcams at home. This set the stage for video calling software to become popular. Microsoft Net Meeting was preloaded into a lot of PCs, but it was mostly popular in work settings. Some instant messengers like Yahoo Messenger and MSN started adding video calling functionality, but the most popular peer-to-peer video software was Skype, which was released in 2003 and quickly bought by eBay for $2.5 billion. At this point, it was clear that video calling could be lucrative and was around to stay. So many different options started to pop up, and they all had their own flavor. Skype was known as the service that you would use to call your family, maybe if they lived in another country. International calls were super expensive then, and that's why everybody uses WhatsApp now, right? So being able to do it for free or for the cheap on the internet became a really popular strategy. The only issue is getting your grandma in Latvia to install the Skype software on her computer, and that probably took a lot of troubleshooting. For kids messing around on the computer though, ooVoo was one of the most popular options. ooVoo was actually based on technology invented in 1982 at Arrow Communications. And it was originally intended to be for e-learning or remote work collaboration kinds of settings. But when they saw the potential for video chatting in the mid-2000s, They went private and relaunched as ooVoo in 2007. The quality on ooVoo was better than the competitors, the interface was cooler and sleeker, and you could have multiple people on the call, up to 6 for a free account, to 12 for a paid account. If one of your friends had the paid account, that was all you needed. You can get 12 people in the chat. So I remember in high school, it was pretty sick. One person had the paid account. So as long as they were there, we could make the whole thing happen. This Forbes article about ooVoo from 2012 is super fascinating. ooVoo wasn't launched or directed towards teens, but teens latched onto it because it was cooler than Skype. And it was free, so they didn't have to ask their parents for money. And you needed to accept someone before they could call or message you, which meant that no random strangers could contact you, which was great for parents. If you've seen my video about Formspring, then you would know in the late 2000s, early 2010s, anonymous randos on the internet were making life weird for teenagers. So that privacy was a pretty big deal for parents at the time. So of course, the competitors were gonna come eventually. Apple launched FaceTime in 2011. I remember because of the fabulous lyric,
give you that iPhone 4, FaceTime.
But so now, if you have an iPhone, an iPad, or a Mac, you could video call anybody who has one of those devices. But in 2012, there were only 44 million iPhone users in the United States. I know that sounds like a lot, but today there are almost 125 million iPhone users in the US. So it was 3 times smaller of a population back then. In the early 2010s, many people still had Androids, Windows phones, flip phones, Motorola Razrs, Sidekicks, Blackberries. So putting 6 people into a FaceTime was not realistic. Putting them in an ooVoo chat was so much easier. They had an iOS app, they had an Android app, and it would just work in your computer browser. You didn't even have to download anything. But the writing was on the wall for ooVoo because they can never really make enough money. Skype managed to not have to worry about that because they got bought by eBay and then eventually bought by Microsoft. And they had a huge user base and a cultural acceptance that this was the way to talk to your distant friends or family. Even though modern video calling services like Google Meet or Zoom have eaten into their market share today, they're still around for a reason. ooVoo, on the other hand, never figured out a way to be profitable. In 2017, after 200 million users in 78 countries, ooVoo announced that they were shutting down. The 2012 Forbes article also kind of foreshadowed this. The company never disclosed its finances or what percentage of its users were paid users. Instead, it was proud of its teen cult status. And that makes sense. Teen cult status is a very enviable thing, and it's something that a lot of companies try and fail to achieve. But it's also a very fickle thing, and that's the issue. Teenagers are a demographic that move on very quickly. This page on r/teenagers helps us understand how things like ooVoo come and go. Bronx Kid 409 said it was popular for a year and then died. TGE Visions, who probably had a YouTube account that posted like Call of Duty no-scope clips in 2011 with that username, said it happened at his school, but people aren't using it as much anymore. Appy Dash put it the best. It will pass. It came and went here. So like many things on the internet, ooVoo came and it went. Once again, we see that people love to say the internet is forever, but there are so many things that are completely gone that used to be a big part of our internet experience. But the story of video chatting going from a dream to this obscure, unaffordable novelty to being something we all use pretty much every day is fascinating. And it's really interesting to see people in the 70s be like, I don't want to be on camera, because I know I'm always going to think about that the next time I'm on a Zoom call and I'm dreading having to turn my camera on. And most of all, what I'm really going to miss is those random dicks on Omegle. I wish I knew to enjoy them when I had them.